It was supposed to be a short-term thing, a little apartment on the edge of downtown, perfect for someone like me who was just starting out, fresh out of college, a new job, and the excitement of living on my own. I didn't need much, just a small space to call mine. The apartment I found was cheap, tucked away in an old brick building, the kind that always seems to have a story. The walls were thin, the floors creaked with every step, but I didn't mind. It was a place to start, and I could make it work. But the first night I stayed there, things didn't feel right. I had just moved in and wasn't used to the noises yet. Every apartment has its own rhythm, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, but there was something else that night. I was lying in bed, the soft glow of a lamp on my nightstand, when I first heard it, a whisper. At first, I thought I was imagining it, just the wind, or maybe the apartment settling, but it wasn't the wind. I could hear it clearly now. It sounded like someone was talking, but the words were muffled, like they were coming from inside the walls. I froze. I strained my ears, but the whispering didn't stop. It was low, indistinct, almost urgent, and it sent a chill down my spine. I jumped out of bed, rushing to the living room, my heart pounding in my chest. The apartment was dark, except for the faint streetlight filtering in through the window. I glanced around, searching for the source of the sound, but the apartment was still, and no one was there. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. Maybe the building was just old and creaky, and I was being paranoid. But then it happened again. A knock. Soft but distinct, like it was right outside my door. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. No one should be there. It was late, and I hadn't heard anyone in the hallway. Yet there it was, another knock. I opened the door, but the hallway was empty. I closed it quickly, locking it behind me. I didn't know what to think. I was alone. I didn't have any friends in the building, no visitors, nothing. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that I was just imagining things. I turned off the lights, crawled back into bed, and tried to sleep. But the whispering never stopped. Over the next few days, the whispers became harder to ignore. It wasn't just a random sound anymore. It was a constant presence. It was as though the voice was trying to communicate with me, but it was always too muffled, too distant. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the tone. It was pleading, desperate, like someone was trapped. I began to feel a sense of dread creeping in. Every night, the whispers would get louder, more insistent, and sometimes I swore I could hear scratching against the walls, as if someone, or something, was trying to get through. It wasn't just the whispers, though. There was something else. On the fourth night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was like dragging, something heavy, scraping across the floor. I could hear it coming from the wall next to my bed. My breath hitched in my throat as I realized it was moving toward me. I jumped up, my heart racing. I pressed my ear to the wall, straining to hear. There it was again, dragging, scraping, getting closer. I stumbled back, almost falling to the floor, my mind spinning. My eyes flicked to the hallway outside my bedroom door, but the apartment was completely silent. I grabbed my phone and called the landlord, my voice shaky as I demanded to know what was going on. "What do you mean?" the landlord asked, his voice calm and dismissive. "There's nothing wrong with your apartment. It's an old building, but it's been renovated. No one's ever complained about noises before." I hung up before he could say anything else. My hands were shaking, but I had to figure this out. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. The next morning, I left for work. But as I stepped out of the apartment building, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a woman standing outside the building. Her face was hidden beneath the hood of her coat, and she was staring directly at me. For a moment, I froze. Her eyes were hollow, sunken deep into her face, and there was something unsettling about the way she stood there, like she had been waiting for me. I shook it off, convinced I was just being paranoid, and went about my day. But when I came home that night, I could hear the whispers again. This time they were louder, more distinct. The words started to come through, but they weren't in English. I couldn't make sense of them, but I knew that I had to do something. I rushed to the wall, my fingers pressing against the cold surface as I listened. And that's when I realized something. The voices weren't coming from the apartment next door. They were coming from within the walls themselves. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and started digging into the drywall. It was slow, painful work, but I had to know. The scraping noise grew louder, almost frantic, and then my knife hit something hard. I pried it loose. Inside the wall, hidden behind layers of old insulation, was a tattered journal, its pages covered in blood-stained fingerprints. The first page was a mess of symbols I didn't recognize, but as I flipped through, I found something that stopped me cold. A picture. A woman. Her face identical to the one I had seen standing outside the building. The name written beneath it was Megan Harris, and the last entry read, "Abo, I'm trapped in the walls. Please help me." I ran from the apartment that night, never looking back. The whispers followed me out the door, as though they were alive, desperate to get to me. I never spoke to anyone in the building again. The landlord told me the next day that the apartment was being renovated and was no longer available. But I knew the truth. The woman outside the building, Megan Harris, she had died in that apartment years ago in a brutal murder. And the voices in the walls, they were never going to stop. I didn't know what to expect when I moved into my new apartment in downtown Denver. A fresh start. I had just graduated college and gotten a job at a marketing firm, so the timing felt perfect. The apartment was small, but it was all mine. Just one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living room with a big window that overlooked the city streets. I loved it. At first, everything was normal. It was quiet, with just the occasional hum of traffic outside. My neighbors were all friendly, always waving when I saw them in the hallway, but nobody ever seemed to stick around too long. That's how city living is, right? People come and go. But something happened a few weeks after I settled in, something small that I couldn't quite explain. I had just gotten back from a work event around 9 p.m. on a Wednesday, tired but relieved to be home. I grabbed a snack from the kitchen and collapsed onto the couch, scrolling through my phone to unwind. The apartment was silent, except for the occasional car passing by outside. Then suddenly, a knock at the door. Knock, knock, knock. It was sharp, loud. I froze. I hadn't been expecting anyone. I hesitated before getting up, glancing through the peephole. No one was there, just the dimly lit hallway, the shadows stretching across the floor. I shook my head, thinking it was probably just a neighbor or a delivery driver, maybe someone who had knocked by mistake. But the strange thing was, the more I thought about it, the more I realized I hadn't heard the sound of footsteps walking away. I opened the door. No one was there. I looked up and down the hallway. Nothing. I figured it was nothing. Maybe it was just a prank. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. The exhaustion from the day getting to me. The growing suspicion. But the knocking didn't stop. Every few days, at random hours, it would happen again. And every time, I would open the door to find nothing. Knock, knock, knock. Sometimes it was late at night, other times in the middle of the afternoon. It never made sense. I started to get nervous. Maybe I had a weird neighbor, or worse, someone who had gotten the wrong idea about me. But I never called the landlord or the police. I didn't want to sound crazy. I didn't want to overreact. Then one evening, it escalated. I was sitting on my couch watching TV when I heard it again. This time, the knock was more urgent, like someone was waiting. I got up, went to the door, and glanced through the peephole. There he was, a man standing just outside the door, his face half-shadowed. He was tall, wearing a hoodie, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I couldn't make out his features, but his eyes, I'll never forget his eyes. They were wide, intense, almost desperate. I took a step back. My heart began to pound in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to call the police, but my hand was frozen, unable to even touch my phone. He knocked again. Knock, knock, knock. I swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and slowly backed away from the door. I didn't want to panic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this man, whoever he was, wasn't just lost or looking for directions. There was something off about him. The knocking continued for what felt like hours. I sat in the dark, barely able to breathe, trying to convince myself that he would eventually leave, but he didn't. And then, just when I thought it was finally quiet, I heard it, a scratching sound from the door. I rushed to the peephole again. The man was no longer standing in front of the door, but now his hand was on the doorknob, twisting it. I was paralyzed with fear. He was trying to get in. I backed away, running into my bedroom and locking the door behind me. My phone was shaking in my hands as I dialed 911. But before the call could even connect, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps. I held my breath, waiting. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I heard him take a deep breath. Then, he knocked again. Knock, knock, knock. The operator finally picked up, and I told her everything. She said officers were on their way, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. They checked the building's security footage, and that's when things got even weirder. The man had been wandering the halls of the building for days, knocking on doors, but never staying long enough for anyone to get a clear look at him. He had even been caught on camera, lingering in the hall outside my door, just standing there, watching. The police couldn't find him. He had vanished, as if he had never been there at all. The building's security cameras didn't provide any solid evidence of who he was, or why he'd been targeting me. The worst part was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't stay in that apartment much longer after that. I packed up and moved to a new place, one far from the city. But to this day, I'll never forget the knocking. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I still hear it. I didn't notice anything was wrong at first. That's what still bothers me the most. I lived in that house for nearly a month before I realized someone else was living there too. Let me explain. I had just moved to Seattle after a rough breakup. I needed a fresh start, something quiet and low maintenance. So I rented a small one-bedroom house on the edge of the city. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was cheap and had a fenced-in yard for my dog Cooper. For the first few weeks, everything was normal, or at least I thought it was. But looking back, the signs were there. Strange things I ignored. Little things. A cabinet door left open when I swore I had closed it. Food missing, but only in small amounts, just enough that I assumed I had miscounted. One time, I found a coffee mug in the sink that I didn't remember using, but I chalked it up to stress, to being forgetful. Then one night, I came home late from work and found the attic hatch slightly open. I stopped cold. I had never been in the attic. I didn't even have a ladder to reach it. I told myself the landlord must have left it open by accident while doing maintenance. I wanted to believe that, because the alternative was too disturbing to consider. So, like an idiot, I pushed it shut and moved on. It wasn't until 3 weeks later that I knew something was wrong. It was a Tuesday night. I had come home early and was sitting in the living room when Cooper, normally a laid-back, lazy dog, started growling at the ceiling. Not barking, not running to the door, just sitting completely still, staring upward, a deep, guttural growl rumbling from his chest. A chill ran down my spine. I held my breath, listening. Then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible shuffling above me. In the attic. I don't remember standing up, but suddenly, I was in the kitchen, gripping the biggest knife I could find. My heart slammed against my ribs as I slowly backed toward the front door. Then, a creak, not from the attic. From the hallway, I spun around so fast I nearly dropped the knife. And that's when I saw her. A woman, standing in my hallway. She was thin, pale, her hair hanging in tangled clumps around her face. And she was smiling. The worst realization of my life. My body locked up. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. I knew every inch of this house. I lived here. So how long had she been here? She took a small step forward. "You're home early," she said. Like she knew me. Like we were roommates or something. That snapped me out of it. I ran. I bolted out the door, nearly tripping over myself, and sprinted to my neighbor's house. I don't even remember calling 911, but the next thing I knew, the police were there. When they went inside, she was gone. But the attic hatch, it was wide open. What the police found. They searched the house from top to bottom. And that's when they found it. A small pile of blankets, empty food wrappers, a plastic water bottle, and a journal. She had been living in my attic for weeks. Reading through her journal made me physically sick because she wrote about me. What time I woke up, what time I left for work, what I ate for dinner. One page just said, "I think he suspects something. I have to be more careful." The police never found her. They said she had probably been sneaking down at night while I slept, eating just enough to not be noticed, staying out of sight during the day. The scariest part? I don't know how she got in. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken windows, no unlocked doors. To this day, I still wonder. Had she been there before I moved in? Or did she come in later? I don't think I'll ever know, but I do know one thing. I never sleep without checking the attic. Caleb Renshaw never considered himself the paranoid type. He was a 31-year-old elementary school teacher living in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside of Austin, Texas. It wasn't the kind of place you worried about home invasions. It was the kind of place where neighbors smiled, where kids rode their bikes in the streets, where people left their doors unlocked without a second thought. But that was before the night someone knocked. It was a Friday evening, just after 11:30 p.m. Caleb had been grading papers in the living room, half watching a rerun of an old crime show in the background. His dog, Murphy, a 9-year-old Labrador mix, was curled up beside him, snoring softly. Then, 3 knocks. Soft, deliberate, just loud enough to be heard. Caleb frowned. Who would be knocking this late? He grabbed his phone, glancing at the security app linked to his front door camera. No one was there. The porch light illuminated the empty driveway, the still street beyond. Maybe it was just kids messing around. Another knock, harder this time. Murphy's ears perked up, his head tilting toward the door. A low, uneasy growl rumbled from his throat. Caleb hesitated, his pulse quickening. Something felt off. He wasn't expecting anyone. His friends knew to text before stopping by. His neighbors were all older, early risers, not the kind to show up at nearly midnight. He stepped toward the door, phone in hand, his thumb hovering over the emergency dial button. Still, no one was on the camera. Then a voice. Open up. It was a whisper. A man's voice. Too calm. Too controlled. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. Murphy let out a deep, guttural growl. The fur along his spine bristled. He never reacted like this. Not to the mailman, not to passing cars. Only once before. 3 years ago, when a stranger had tried breaking into his back gate. A cold wave of dread crawled up Caleb's spine. Someone was there. And they were hiding from the camera. He reached for the baseball bat he kept near the shoe rack, gripping it tightly as he took another cautious step toward the peephole. His blood ran cold. There was an eye, pressed right up against the peephole, unblinking, staring. Caleb stumbled back, his heart slamming against his ribs. The voice came again, barely a whisper. I see you. Murphy barked, loud and furious. The eye vanished. Silence. Then, footsteps. Slow, dragging, moving away from the front door. Caleb's hands trembled as he checked his security cameras again. Still nothing, but he knew someone was out there. Then came the noise from the backyard. A soft creak, the unmistakable sound of the wooden gate swinging open. Caleb's stomach twisted. His backyard had no camera. Whoever it was, they knew that. Murphy was already at the back door, barking frantically, his nails scraping against the hardwood floor. Caleb grabbed his phone, dialed 911. 911? What's your emergency? Caleb's voice shook. There's someone trying to get into my house. The operator's tone stayed calm, but Caleb could hear the urgency in her voice. Is the person inside your home? He swallowed hard, creeping toward the back door. The porch light was off. Caleb knew he had turned it on earlier. Something moved in the darkness. A figure, tall, standing unnaturally still. Caleb's entire body locked up. He could feel his pulse in his throat. The operator's voice brought him back. Sir, I need you to stay somewhere safe. Officers are on their way. But Caleb couldn't move, because the figure in the backyard wasn't alone. Another shadow separated from the first, then another. 3 figures, standing in the dark, watching, waiting. The back door handle rattled. Caleb barely choked down a scream. He grabbed Murphy by the collar and backed away, just as the kitchen window creaked. A dark-gloved hand slid beneath it, fingers curling under the glass. The operator's voice was distant now, drowned out by the pounding of Caleb's own heartbeat. Then, sirens. Blue and red lights flooded the yard. Shadows scattered. The figures bolted into the woods behind the house. A knock at the front door. This time it was the police. The officers searched the area, but the intruders were gone. Whoever they were, they had been cutting the power to his cameras. They had waited for the exact moment Caleb was alone. And the worst part? One of the officers found a crowbar and a duffel bag hidden behind the bushes. Inside were zip ties, duct tape, and a long rope. They weren't just trying to break in. They were planning to stay. Caleb never slept in that house again. He packed up and moved within a week. To this day, he doesn't know who they were, what they wanted, or why they chose him. But sometimes, when he's alone at night, he still dreams of it, that whisper at his door. Open up.